Enrique and Moises, thank you for joining us. Genizaro is a new term for most of us. Who were the Genizaros?
The Genizaros were a third of the population of what the people that we would call Hispanic New Mexicans today.
What time period was that? In the late 19th?
By the census of 1790, these figures start popping out. Some of them specifically Genizaro, and some you could identify them as Genizaros by the use of a first name and not a last name, and certain professions were obviously servile professions because they were servants and slaves.
So these were people who were captured and sold to families, to Hispanic families?
There was definitely a market for captives, but there was also, by the late 18th century, there was a governor, Tomás Vélez Gachupin, that, because the population was so big in the 18th century, had a vision of establishing an outer ring of buffer settlements by two Genizaro land grants, such as Belén, Carnué, Las Huertas, Abiquiu, San Miguel del Vado, just to name a few.
So they were granted to the Genizaro families. These were land grants on sort of the buffer of the frontier and between the established settlements and...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times they were placed between, say, by Belén, by the Apacheria to the south, Carnué and Las Huertas, which was the entrance, Terrace Canyon, the entrance, and the buffer lands, the borderlands of the Comancheria. You had Abiquiu, which was the buffer lands of the Navajo and Ute territory, Provincia de Navajo. So these were often, definitely, these communities were the borderlands.
You said that up to a third of our population by that census were considered Genizaros. So these were people who were slaves or descendants of slaves who were captured and sold? Well,
they weren't permanently slaves. They were purchased, but people would pay a ransom. People would rescue them. It was called a rescate, which means rescue. And this brought on an obligation to also Hispanicize them. They would learn Spanish. They would learn Catholicism. They would learn whatever skills that they could learn in the families. And you could only hold them legally for 15 years before freeing them. Others sought their freedom by expressing the wish to marry. Some women would get stuck in families permanently by having kids with the men in the families. And there's stuff in the chronicles and the archives where you'll get a 14-year-old woman petitioning to marry her 15-year-old boyfriend to get out of the family that she's been in, and just demanding her freedom through marriage. And so you get a sizable population of free Genizaros by the 1710, 1720. There's
a largely unknown history in New Mexico about slavery. So who was capturing, who are the people who were captured, and who was doing the capturing and who was doing the selling?
Well, there's a process. I mean, let's one thing we need to remember, that after the Pueblo Revolt,
in
the
1680,
Popé released a lot of the horses and a lot of the sheep that ended up being introduced to the Diné, the Navajo. The Comanches on the other side of the mountain range to the east, and the Utes thrived and changed their whole culture based on equestrian culture. By the early 1700s, there was massive raids by Ute and Comanche and other tribes like the Kiowa. So you had raids that were coming into the Rio Grande, Upper Rio Grande Basin and Upper Rio Grande Valley, raiding pueblos and Hispanic settlements. Then there was retaliation raids. In this process, captive children were taken in both directions. as you establish buffer settlements like Abacu or Carnue, for example, then what happens is you have these communities experiencing raids as their own, and they're also going off on retaliation raids. So by the time you reach the 1800s, or even the period of the Mexican period, which the Mexican period was probably the most unstable period, you even had more movements between groups through retaliated raids between different groups. There's even a whole group of the Navajo nation called the Nakai Dene that takes its roots in captives that went the other way.
Enrique, even children were given as wedding presents. Can you talk about that?
Young couples upon marriage would get a small child, a small Indian child, as a wedding present, and
to be a servant,
to be a companion to the future children of the family. Sometimes it worked out in very, very positive ways, and sometimes it didn't. This was a common practice from the late 18th century clear into the late 19th century.
What happened to the Genizaros?
We're still here.
Because you have back.
Yeah, I'm from the land grant community of Las Huertas. I'm a member of the Las Huertas community on North Sandias, and I'm actually the president of the Cañón de Carnue land grant. So a lot of people think, well, or historians will say, well, during the plan of Igala that, the category of Genizaro was taken off, and therefore everybody absorbed into being Mexican. And although that was the plan of the Mexican government to kind of erase particular specific indigenous identity as becoming a Mexican state with a mestizo Mexican identity, that didn't happen. You had a lot of communities that still maintain their culture through ritual. So if you go to communities like Cañón de Carnue, will observe ritual dances such as the matachines or the comanchitos, or you go to places like Abacu. There was a lot of effort put forth by even New Mexican identity, New Mexican education, to create a mythical, basically the myth of the Spanish American identity. And that's been fundamental of the school system to within creating Hispanic identity, which is basically, for those of us from the mountain land grant communities, we are exposed, every generation is exposed to the history and legacy of this inter-exchange with Apache people and Comanche people, at least specifically in my community.
Talk about some of the rituals that are still celebrated even today in communities that trace their history to the Genizaros. And we have some photos. I mean, you mentioned La Madera.
That remembers a time and place where, through the Sandia communities, when the men would leave on the buffalo hunts in October, and the women would have to basically defend communities such as La Madera, San Antonio de Padua along North 14. The men would leave on the hunts, and they would come back in October, right before Christmas. There's an initiation of captives that were traded probably with Comanches, that were captive from other tribes that were brought in. And this is a ritual dance that initiates captives into the community that are brought into community.
Enrique, what about in Abacu? We have a photo as well of one of the ceremonies.
Yeah, captives are a theme in all of these celebrations. And again, as Moises was saying, the Genizaro identity is undisturbed. It's continuous in these land grant communities that were a long ways from the valleys and the main population in many cases. The majority of Genizaros assimilated into Hispano, Nuevo Mexicano culture and community, and some assimilated into Pueblo communities as well. And so the majority of this 1/3 of the population becomes Hispano, becomes Pueblo. But the communities, these Genizaro communities, celebrate captives because that's the main theme. You can, if you go to a a dance in ABQ, you can get taken captive yourself, and then someone has to pay your rescue. I own.
So if I go, you were saying you own what?
I own an ethnomusicologist by the name of Brenda Romero. We were in ABQ together, and she was captured. And people say, can anybody vouch for her? Does anybody know this India? And I said, I do, and I bought her for $5. And it's a pantomime, and it's satirical at this point. Up in ranchos, you see a lot of captive taking as well, even with adults. And the dances actually honor the captives as they bring them into the culture.
How does the story of the Genizaros challenge our current understanding of New Mexico identity?
I think what's very important to understand is that it upsets the tricultural myth. The tricultural myth is that, you know, three cultures, Pueblo, Hispano, and Anglo, live in this simultaneous harmony. And it kind of erases the historical violence that happened through iterations of colonialism. Genizaro identity places itself out of that tricultural myth, and it embraces indigenous identity and the realization of violence and trauma, and the ways in which we remember a violent colonial history. And then it envisions a futuristic identity that says we can continue to exist outside of this tricultural myth, and we can challenge these notions. And meanwhile, we refuse to be rendered by the state, and we render ourselves through our own ritual and our own relationships and our own history with each other.
Well, I want to thank you both for coming and talking about this. It's really fascinating.